The world did not end on September 26, 1983, but it almost did. And the only reason you are alive today, the only reason any of us are sitting here, breathing, going about our ordinary lives, is because of one man in one room, staring at one screen, who decided to trust his gut over his orders. This is the story of the night the Cold War came within minutes of becoming the last night in human history. This is the story of Stanislav Petrov. To understand how close we came, you have to understand the world in 1983. Not the sanitized, textbook version of the Cold War, the chess match of diplomacy and ideology, but the raw, visceral, paranoid reality of two superpowers pointing enough nuclear warheads at each other to end civilization 17 times over. The United States and the Soviet Union had been locked in this grotesque dance of mutual destruction for nearly 4 decades. Both sides knew that if one launched, the other would launch. Both sides knew there would be no winners. And yet, both sides kept their fingers hovering over the button, kept their missiles fueled and ready, kept their early warning systems scanning the skies 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because the alternative, to stand down, to trust the enemy, to blink, felt like surrender. By 1983, the tension was not simmering. It was boiling. It had been building for years, tightening like a coil, and that year it reached a pitch that historians would later describe as the most dangerous moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Ronald Reagan had taken office in 1981 with a rhetorical ferocity toward the Soviet Union that sent shockwaves through Moscow. He called them the evil empire. He announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, the press called it, a plan to build a missile shield in space that would, in Soviet eyes, give America the ability to launch a first strike and then hide behind a technological umbrella. To Washington, it was defense. To Moscow, it looked like preparation for annihilation. The Soviets were already on edge. Their economy was straining under the weight of military spending. Their leadership was aging, ill, and paranoid. Yuri Andropov, the general secretary of the Communist Party, was a former KGB chief who had spent his career immersed in the dark arts of intelligence and suspicion. He genuinely believed, not as propaganda, but as personal conviction, that Ronald Reagan was planning a nuclear first strike against the Soviet Union. In late 1981, the KGB and Soviet military intelligence had launched Operation Ryan, the largest peacetime intelligence operation in Soviet history, dedicated entirely to detecting signs of an imminent American nuclear attack. Thousands of agents across the world were tasked with monitoring American military bases, watching for unusual activity, tracking the movements of politicians and generals, measuring the blood supply in hospitals near American cities. Every anomaly was a potential signal. Every exercise was a potential cover. The Soviet intelligence apparatus was primed, tuned to the highest possible sensitivity, searching for the first tremor of the earthquake they were convinced was coming. And then in September of 1983, the earthquake seemed to arrive. Not a nuclear one, not yet, but a catastrophic provocation that pushed both superpowers to the absolute edge. On September 1, 1983, a Soviet Su-15 interceptor jet shot down Korean Airlines Flight 7, a civilian Boeing 747 that had strayed into Soviet airspace. All 269 people aboard were killed, including an American congressman. The world erupted. Reagan condemned the act as a crime against humanity. The United Nations Security Council was paralyzed by Soviet vetoes. Anti-Soviet protests broke out across the Western world. In Moscow, the reaction was defiance. Officials insisted the plane was on a spy mission, but beneath the bluster, the leadership was shaken, isolated, and more convinced than ever that America was moving toward open confrontation. The KGB intensified Operation Ryan. The early warning stations were placed on higher alert. The knife edge that the two superpowers had been balanced on for decades was now impossibly, terrifyingly thin. It was into this atmosphere, this pressure cooker of suspicion and fear and hair-trigger readiness, that Stanislav Petrov walked for his shift on the night of September 26, 1983. Petrov was 44 years old. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces, an engineer by training and temperament, the kind of man who understood systems, who thought in logic and probability, who had a natural skepticism toward conclusions that weren't supported by evidence. He was not, by his own description, an especially political man. He did his job, he followed procedures, he went home. He was assigned to the Serpukhov 15 bunker facility, a secret command center located about 60 miles south of Moscow, buried deep underground and protected by layers of concrete and steel. This was one of the nerve centers of the Soviet early warning system. OKO, it was called, meaning eye. a network of satellites and ground-based radar designed to detect the launch of American intercontinental ballistic missiles and give the Soviet leadership enough warning to authorize a retaliatory strike before the incoming warheads arrived. On that particular night, Petrov was filling in. His regular shift commander was unavailable and Petrov had been assigned to take over. He settled into the command seat, surrounded by his team of analysts and operators, screens glowing in the darkness of the bunker, the hum of electronics filling the air. Outside, autumn was settling over Russia. Inside, the world was the same as it always was, tense, watchful, ready. Then, at a few minutes past midnight, the alarm went off. Not a drill, not a test. The real alarm. The screen in front of Petrov flashed a single word in large red letters: launch. The system was reporting that an American intercontinental ballistic missile had been launched from the United States, one missile heading for the Soviet Union. Petrov's training told him what to do. The protocol was clear. You receive a launch detection, you report it up the chain of command immediately without hesitation. The generals would then assess and advise the political leadership. The political leadership would decide whether to authorize a retaliatory strike. The entire system, the entire terrifying machinery of nuclear deterrence, was built on speed. The window between detection and impact was roughly 25 minutes. There was no time for doubt. There was no time for second guessing. The protocol existed precisely to eliminate the human tendency to hesitate when the stakes were unthinkable. You see the alarm, you report the alarm. That was the job. But Stanislav Petrov did not report the alarm. He sat in his chair, staring at the screen, and he did not pick up the phone. He was thinking. The system was saying one missile. One, and Petrov's brain, working through the logic with the calm, methodical precision of an engineer, kept snagging on that number. One missile. If the Americans were launching a nuclear first strike, the scenario that the entire Soviet military apparatus had been preparing for, that Operation Ryan had been designed to detect, that General Secretary Andropov had been warning about for years, they would not send one missile. They would send everything. A first strike was an all-or-nothing proposition. You launched everything simultaneously to destroy the enemy's retaliatory capability before they could respond. A single missile accomplished nothing. It would land, it would destroy whatever it hit, and then the Soviets would launch everything in response, and America would be incinerated, and the entire calculation that had kept both sides from pulling the trigger, the logic of mutual assured destruction, meant that no rational military commander would ever order a single missile strike. It made no strategic sense. It made no sense at all. And yet, the alarm was not a drill. The system was designed to be reliable. Petrov's superiors trusted it. His training told him to trust it. The word on the screen was real and the implication was clear, and 25 minutes was not a lot of time. Then the alarm changed. The screen updated. Now it was not one missile. Now the system was reporting a second launch, then a third, then a fourth, then a fifth. In the span of a few minutes, the OCO satellite system was reporting 5 separate ICBM launches from the United States, all heading for the Soviet Union. The alarm level escalated to its highest setting. The word on the screen changed. The system was now registering not just a launch detection but a confidence rating for that detection, and the confidence rating was reading at the highest possible level. Reliable. The computer was not hedging. The computer was certain. The room around Petrov was erupting. His analysts were calling out data. Alarms were sounding. Every face in the bunker was turned toward him, waiting. He was the senior officer on duty. He was the one with the phone. He was the one who had to make the call. And Stanislav Petrov sat in his chair and thought about the satellites. The OCO system worked by detecting the infrared signatures of missile launches, the enormous heat plume that an ICBM produces as its engines ignite and it climbs out of the atmosphere. The satellites were positioned in orbit specifically to watch American missile fields, to catch that first flash of fire. And Petrov knew, because he had studied these systems, because he was an engineer who understood their mechanics, that the satellites were not perfect. They were relatively new. They had known vulnerabilities. They could, under certain conditions, confuse the reflected glare of sunlight off the tops of clouds for the heat signature of a missile launch. It was a known flaw. It had been documented. It had happened before in testing. 5 missiles, sunlight clouds, a flaw in the system. Or 5 real ICBMs, inbound, and 20-something minutes until Soviet cities started disappearing in nuclear fire. Petrov had to decide right now, this second. He picked up the phone, he called his duty officer at headquarters, and he told them that the alert was a false alarm. He did not know it was a false alarm. He could not know. He was making a judgment call in real time under the most unimaginable pressure a human being can face, with the fate of civilization sitting on one side of the scales and his own career, his freedom, and possibly his life on the other. If he was wrong, if those were real missiles, then his hesitation would mean the Soviet leadership had no time to respond, no time to authorize a retaliatory strike, and the warheads would hit Soviet soil while the missiles sat in their silos. The blood of millions would be on his hands. He would have failed the most fundamental duty of his post. He would have betrayed his country. But he made the call, false alarm, stand down. The minutes passed. No missiles arrived. The OCO system, it would later be determined, had malfunctioned exactly as Petrov suspected. A rare alignment of the satellite's orbit with the angle of the sun over the American Midwest had caused the infrared sensors to misinterpret reflected sunlight as missile exhaust plumes. The computer had applied its algorithms, calculated confidence levels, and reached a conclusion that was entirely catastrophically wrong. The software had a bug. The hardware had a vulnerability. And the system that the Soviet military trusted with the lives of every person on Earth had looked up at a Midwestern afternoon sky and screamed nuclear war. But the story does not end there, because while Petrov had prevented one potential catastrophe, the world was not yet safe. The same month, the same nightmarish, impossible month of October and November 1983, NATO was conducting a massive military exercise called Able Archer 83. It was a command post exercise, a simulation of a full-scale nuclear conflict, designed to test NATO's procedures for escalating from conventional to nuclear war. It involved an unprecedented level of realism. It included, for the first time, realistic communications protocols, real participation from heads of state, simulated nuclear weapons releases. To any outside observer with incomplete information, to KGB analysts scanning signals intelligence, to a Soviet military officer watching unusual radio traffic and unexpected movements of personnel, Able Archer 83 looked terrifyingly like the real thing. Soviets panicked. KGB stations in Western Europe and the United States were flooded with frantic inquiries from Moscow. Was this the cover? Was NATO using the exercise as preparation for an actual strike? Soviet nuclear forces in East Germany and Poland were placed on higher readiness. Aircraft were armed. In some cases, launch preparations were begun. Senior officials in Moscow genuinely believed for the duration of that exercise that they might be hours away from nuclear war. They were watching shadows, but the shadows looked exactly like the real thing. There is a document, declassified decades later, in which British intelligence, which had an asset deep inside the KGB, reported to the British government that the Soviet reaction to Able Archer 83 was not posturing, not theater, not political maneuvering. The Soviets were genuinely scared. The intelligence officer's assessment was stark. The Soviet leadership believed in those weeks that war was possible, perhaps imminent. When Margaret Thatcher received this assessment, she was reportedly shaken. When Ronald Reagan was briefed on it, on the fact that the Soviet Union had, for a period, genuinely believed that his administration was preparing to launch a nuclear attack, his reaction was something he recorded in his diary with unusual candor. He was surprised. He had not believed that the Soviets were truly afraid of America. He had thought the rhetoric was a game, a bargaining position, a performance. The intelligence assessment forced him to confront the possibility that the other side had been just as terrified as his own. That both superpowers had been staring at each other across the abyss, each convinced the other was about to jump, each reacting to the other's fear in ways that increased the other's fear, in a feedback loop of paranoia that could have, at any moment, crossed the threshold from simulation to reality. Historians who have studied this period, what they call the War Scare of 1983, argue that this was in aggregate the most dangerous moment of the Cold War. More dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis in some respects, because the Cuban crisis was visible, it was understood, it was being managed consciously by leaders on both sides who knew they were in a crisis and were actively trying to resolve it. The War Scare of 1983 was invisible. It was happening in the gap between perception and reality, in the space between what each side thought the other was doing and what the other was actually doing. The Soviet leadership was not performing fear for political advantage. They were genuinely afraid. And they were afraid in a system where the machinery of retaliation was designed to operate faster than human doubt, in a culture where to hesitate was to fail, where the first instinct of every officer at every level was to report up, to escalate, to let the system do what the system was built to do. Stanislav Petrov broke that system. He introduced a pause, a breath, a moment of human judgment into a machine that was designed to eliminate human judgment, and in that pause the world survived. Think about who this man was. He was not a president or a general or a spy master. He was a mid-level officer filling in for a colleague, sitting in a bunker that the world didn't know existed, making a decision that the world would not learn about for years. He had no authorization to override the system. His job was to report, not to decide. The decision of whether those missiles were real belonged to the generals and the politicians, not to a lieutenant colonel with an engineering background and a nagging sense that something didn't add up. If he had followed protocol, if he had picked up the phone and reported 5 confirmed ICBM launches, the generals would have received the report. The political leadership would have been awakened. Andropov, sick and frightened and surrounded by advisors who believed America was planning an attack, would have had perhaps 15 minutes to decide whether to authorize a massive retaliatory strike. Given everything we know about the Soviet leadership's state of mind in the fall of 1983, given what the KGB was telling them, given what Operation RYAN had been primed to find, it is not difficult to imagine what they might have decided. They might have launched, not because they wanted war, not because they were evil, but because they were afraid and they were rational, and within the logic of mutual assured destruction, a nation that absorbs a nuclear first strike without retaliating has simply chosen to die. The logic of deterrence only works if both sides believe the other will respond. And so in those 15 minutes, Andropov might have concluded that the missiles were real, that the unthinkable was happening, and that the only thing left to do was make sure the Americans paid the same price. He might have authorized the launch codes. The missiles would have gone up. The American early warning systems would have detected them. The American president would have had his own 15 minutes. And then the warheads would have started falling, on Moscow and Leningrad and Kiev, on New York and Washington and Los Angeles, on military bases and industrial centers and population clusters across 2 continents, 200 million people dead in the first hour, the northern hemisphere blanketed in a cloud of ash and dust and radioactive debris that would block the sun for years, crops failing worldwide, a nuclear winter descending over the entire planet. And the civilization that human beings had spent 10,000 years building simply ending. Because of a software bug, because of sunlight on clouds, because a satellite had a flaw that nobody had fixed in time. And it didn't happen because of one man's decision to pause. Petrov was not celebrated for what he did. He was not given a medal. He was not quietly promoted or privately thanked. His superiors were uncomfortable with the whole situation because his actions, however correct, had violated protocol, and in a system built on protocol, that was a problem. He was questioned. He was evaluated. There were suggestions that his paperwork that night had not been properly filed. He never received a formal reprimand, but he was transferred to a less demanding post, and by his own account, encouraged to take early retirement not long after. He spent years in relative obscurity, living on a modest pension in a small town outside Moscow, gardening, watching television, going about a quiet life while the world went about its business entirely unaware that this man had saved it. The story did not become public until 1998, when a retired Soviet general named Yuri Votintsev published his memoirs and mentioned Petrov in passing. Journalists picked it up. Researchers began to investigate. The details trickled out slowly, imperfectly. Some information was still classified, some recollections were disputed, but the essential outline became clear. A man had been in a bunker. A computer had told him nuclear war was beginning. He had decided not to believe the computer. He had been right. When Western journalists finally found Petrov and asked him about that night, he was reluctant to be called a hero. He deflected. He said that he had been doing his job, that he had done what any reasonable person would have done. He said he was equally guilty and not guilty, that he had been in the right place at the right time or the wrong place at the wrong time, depending on how you looked at it. He seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the weight of what people wanted to place on his shoulders, with the idea that he, one man, had personally prevented nuclear war. He preferred a more modest framing. He had noticed something that didn't add up. He had thought about it. He had made a call. But here is the thing. The fact that it was one man, that it came down to one man's judgment. That the entire elaborate machinery of superpower deterrence, with its satellites and its bunkers and its protocols and its generals and its political leaders with their briefcases and their launch codes, that all of that ultimately came down to a single lieutenant colonel who happened to be filling in for a sick colleague on a Tuesday night in September, that is not a reassuring story. That is a terrifying one. Not because of what Petrov did, but because of how close the margin was. Because of how many other moments there might have been, moments that didn't become famous, moments where someone did follow the protocol, where someone did pick up the phone, where the message went up the chain and the generals woke the politicians and the politicians looked at each other and someone blinked in the wrong direction. There are other cases, we know this now. There are other moments in the Cold War where the machinery came frighteningly close to deciding on its own that the war had started. In 1979, a technician at NORAD accidentally loaded a training tape into a live system. and for 6 minutes American commanders were told that the Soviet Union had launched 250 missiles. Fighters were scrambled. The duty officer reached for the phone. 6 minutes later, they confirmed it was an error. In 1980, a faulty computer chip, a chip that cost 46 cents, caused the American system to report a massive Soviet missile launch. Launch crews were placed on alert. The president's airborne command post was dispatched. It was a false alarm confirmed in minutes, but the reaction had been real. In 1995, after the Cold War was already over, a Norwegian scientific rocket, launched to study the aurora borealis, triggered Soviet radar and came within minutes of reaching Boris Yeltsin's nuclear briefcase before someone figured out what it was. The Cold War, it turns out, was not primarily a story of ideology or geopolitics or the clash of competing economic systems. It was a story of two enormous, terrified institutions pointing weapons at each other in the dark, with systems too complex to fully control, with human beings at every level who were supposed to be removed from the equation but who kept, thankfully, blessedly, imperfectly, inserting themselves back in. The bomb was always the last word, the ultimate argument, the thing that was supposed to make the whole arrangement stable. But stability turned out to be fragile, and the mechanisms of stability turned out to be human, and human beings, with their doubt and their engineering logic and their reluctance to be responsible for the end of the world, turned out to be the only thing that actually stood between civilization and annihilation. Stanislav Petrov died on May 19, 2017. He was 77 years old. He died in his apartment in Fryazevo, a small town outside Moscow, and for months nobody outside of Russia knew. His son later said that his father had been ill, and that in the confusion of illness and death, no one had thought to notify the international community that had in recent years belatedly recognized him. The United Nations had given him an award. A German documentary had been made about him. He had traveled to New York, had visited the UN headquarters, had stood in the building where the fate of the world was supposedly managed, and been thanked, somewhat awkwardly, by diplomats who could barely wrap their minds around what he had done. He had seemed bemused by all of it. He still didn't think of himself as a hero. He had just made a phone call. He had just decided not to make a different phone call. When the world found out he had died, the tributes poured in. World leaders sent statements. Military analysts wrote retrospectives. Journalists who had profiled him years earlier dusted off their notebooks and wrote about the quiet man in the small apartment who had saved civilization. The phrase that kept appearing in article after article was some variation of the same idea: the man who saved the world. It was impossible to resist. It was also in some ways impossible to fully comprehend, because what does it mean to save the world? It means that your action preserved everything. Every person, every city, every library and hospital and school and farm, every sunrise, every conversation, every child who would be born in the decades that followed, every song that would be written, every painting completed, every scientific discovery made. Every ordinary Tuesday morning, every cup of tea, every embrace between people who loved each other. You preserved all of it. You preserved the future itself by doing nothing, by not picking up the phone. There is a photograph of Petrov taken late in his life, a few years before his death. He is standing in his apartment in front of a wall covered with framed photographs and commendations, a slight, unassuming man in his 70s with a quiet expression. He doesn't look like a man who saved the world. He looks like a grandfather. He looks like a man who spent a lot of time in that apartment thinking about things, maybe thinking about that night, maybe not. He said in interviews that he didn't dwell on it, that it was a long time ago, that he had simply made the right call and that anyone in his position would have done the same. But not anyone would have. That is the point. That is the whole point. The system was designed to produce a certain response and he produced a different one. He saw a gap between what the machine was saying and what his own judgment was telling him, and he trusted his judgment. In a system, in a culture, in a moment in history where every force was aligned toward escalation, toward reporting, toward letting the protocol run its course, one man sat down and thought, and decided that 5 missiles didn't make sense. We will never know, not really, not with certainty, whether his intervention actually prevented a nuclear war. We don't know what Andropov would have decided if the report had come in. We don't know whether cooler heads might have prevailed somewhere else in the chain of command. We don't know all the variables. History is not a controlled experiment. You cannot rerun it. You can only look at the evidence, absorb the context, feel the weight of the moment, and understand that the margin was thin. The margin was impossibly, terrifyingly thin. We live in the world that Stanislav Petrov's hesitation made possible. Every single one of us, every person alive on this planet today, is living in the future that he chose to protect when he decided not to trust a computer that told him the world was ending. We are the inheritance of his doubt. We are the children of his pause. The Cold War is over. The Soviet Union is gone. The bunker at Serpikov 15 may still exist somewhere beneath the Russian earth, dark and silent now, its screens blank, its alarms quiet. Monument to a particular kind of madness that human beings are capable of building. But the lesson of that night, the lesson of September 26, 1983, has not expired. It is not dated, because the missiles are still there, not as many perhaps, but enough. Enough to end it, enough to make the same calculation: launch or don't launch, trust the machine or trust the man, as live and as lethal as it was on the night that Stanislav Petrov sat in his chair and chose the world. He chose the world. And the world went on.